So I'm at my home in Broadstairs on the coast, a long way from the University of London where I normally work. But I hope that we can have a good conversation today about open practices, design justice, and the social justice issues behind open access publishing.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. All right, so I wanted to ask you first. We still have students coming. Uh, I wanted to first ask you about your background into, how did you get into open access? How did it come about?
So I actually work in an English department. I'm an English literature scholar, and it during my PhD, it suddenly dawned on me that the academic job market is absolutely terrible, right? It's very hard to get an academic job, which was what I was aspiring to do. And I had backup plans to become a computer programmer if that didn't work. But the thing that annoyed me was that while I was at university, I had access to all this fantastic research, all these resources that came through the university. And I was learning more about the publication system and finding out that academics aren't paid for journal articles. They're not, it's not a revenue source for them or anything by producing these things. But somehow they were producing these things and then they were being sold back to universities. And when I left, I was potentially going to be cut off from that access. And it just seemed to me totally contradictory because you've got people who are working with these lofty ideals about what the university is for, what the point of higher education is, doing this research, publishing about human artifacts, in my case, about literature, which is open to everyone. And they were publishing this in a way that meant that only very few people are ever going to be able to read it. I wasn't going to be able to read it when I left. They sometimes couldn't get access to their own material. And it just dawned on me that this whole thing seemed like a circular mess of craziness that somebody had designed very badly for thinking about why we act in this way. And I guess over time, my anger at this has subsided a little bit and lapsed into a pragmatism. I do accept that we need the labor of publishers to do certain things that we can't do or don't want to do in the academy. But it just struck me there's got to be a better way to do this than to cut people off from access and to make it this circular dependency of you publish the work, then you can't get access to it.
How have things changed since? I mean, when was this? When can you place that historically? We are talking about.
Yeah, so that was around 2010, I guess. The situation then, which was, almost a decade after the Open Access Budapest Declaration, but virtually no work in my field was open access at that point. It was all paywalled. If you wanted access, you had to go through a provider. Also, I don't know if people know, but the boxes that sometimes come up that say you can buy individual access to a journal article, they simply don't work. You end up on a goose chase trying to work out how you can actually get access to the thing. You can't buy it individually if you want to. My friend Ben, who worked at the Higher Education Research Council, HEFCE, for ages, tried this on a series of articles and just found it was impossible as an individual to get this access, even though they advertised it, because what they want is the library subscriptions. But if you think about how things have changed since 2010, there is a lot more content in my discipline that's now openly accessible. It's probably worth also saying, sadly, perhaps from certain perspectives, there are pirate sites that provide a type of open access to this material. It's really funny when people tell me that open access will damage the economic standing of publishers and cause problems for them. And I say, well, it's already accessible, whether you like it or not. Through copyright violation, your work is out there, and it doesn't seem to have dented what you're doing and your labor efforts. So it's an interesting situation at the moment. It feels like we're in a transitional phase in some disciplines. Some disciplines are very advanced in open access, and almost everything in high energy physics, for example, you can read for free. They use arXiv extensively, and that's great. But other disciplines have been much slower. History, for example. But there are signs of this tide shifting. There are mandates from funders. There are academics who are interested in this issue. There are pressures on the academy to make work accessible and to ensure that the public can read it. So I sort of feel it's slow, it's glacially slow, the progress, but there is some shift and change in the attitudes and behaviors of academics towards open access.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about how you started the Open Library of Humanities and then worked on the management on the software on Janeway?
Sure. So
in general terms, I know that you could give.
I mean, right, the main problem for open access in some disciplines, like the humanities, for example, is that the economic model is very different to something like high energy physics, for example. In high energy physics, you get a lot of academics getting grants, and if there's a book processing charge of £12,000 or an article processing charge of £3,000, they can very easily put that on their grant and ask the funder to pay it, because dissemination is obviously part of the goal of those funders. They want the work to be circulated. So this model of article or book processing charges is akin to me saying to the guy on the front row here, right, I want you to pay £3,000 and then everybody else will be able to read your work. So what it's done is it's really concentrated costs on one place, on one person, on one institution. And it said, you bear the total cost of publication. This model really doesn't work very well in my disciplines, which was what publishers were trying to do. They just thought, we've seen that work in the sciences, we'll just make it the same in the humanities and they can pay this. But it turns out that, you know, that grant funded work just doesn't happen in my discipline so much. There are very few grants and they're very hard to get. You've got a situation where institutions are not wealthy enough to pay this from their English or history department budgets. And so, you know, we asked humanities academics, how much could you pay if we had this model? And they just came back saying, well, nothing really. My dean would laugh me out the office if I tried to argue that you should give them £3,000 from the budget just to publish an article, and the next person's going to come along and say the same thing, and on and on. So we had to come up with a new economic model for what open publishing in the humanities would look like, and that's where the Open Library of Humanities came from, was its desire to implement a new model. And what we decided instead was, if we could get, say, 350 libraries worldwide to pay, I don't know, a few £1,000s each into a central pot, we'd have enough to publish all the material that passed peer review that came into us, and we could do that without charging anybody, any academic, a fee. So basically, libraries want open access. We want to make it work in the humanities and can't do article processing charges. What do? We pool funds from those libraries who say they want it to work and use those funds to operate and to run our publisher. And so lots of people said this will never work. You know, what you're doing is you're asking libraries to pay for something that doesn't give them anything. You know, they cannot participate, and if you publish stuff openly, everybody will get it anyway, and that's called the free rider problem. And we just said, well, yes, but as we've said, libraries have been driving this quest for open access for, you know, well over a decade now. They really said they want it. So will they put their money where their mouths are and fund us so we can operate, and so that we can get the humanities academics a space where they can safely publish without those fees blocking their publication? And they did. You know, it took a lot of work. All these projects, if you ever want to build something and make some utopian project that you think will make the world better, you've got to be prepared to put the groundwork in. You know, I was traveling to Japan and one day, Edinburgh the next, and San Francisco after that the next day. It was this very intense period of life where we were getting these libraries on board. But, you know, we did it. We're now stable and funded. I don't run the Open Library of Humanities anymore. I've handed it over to a colleague. So, you know, we've got succession planning, we've got continuity, we've got sustainability. We built something that I think will now last and is a sustainable contribution to this space.
Oh, it's been fantastic. I mean, as you know, permanent awe at what you and the team achieved. Could you tell us a bit more about the relationship between what you have described, which is about the Open Library of Humanities as an organization that it is offering a different way to fund scholarly publishing, probably, and therefore and that includes a different way of making scholarly publications available. And the design of owning the platform that is and that meant designing it from scratch, that also enables this way of financing and providing access. Do they go hand in hand? Can they exist one without the other? How can we learn from that? You know, when people think about designing an interface, how connected is it to the mission of the organization, and how specific was the work on Janeway thinking about the funding and the access enabling aspect?
So an interesting aspect of the launch was that at that point we needed some kind of bootstrapping mechanism to get off the ground. We had this situation where we didn't have a platform that we own. We had potential funder interest and an idea for our sustainable economic model. And we had, you know, one of the options was we can build our own platform from scratch, our own interface and workflow, and it will delay our launch by a good year. We'll spend a year building software, designing an interface, ensuring it all works, and we'll launch, and this software will be brand new, untested, and we're in a difficult situation. So what we did instead was we went to an organization called Ubiquity Press, that is a sadly for-profit publishing services provider. And we partnered with them to operate our platform initially, to give us basically the publishing services that we couldn't get immediately, and use those as the starting point. So that worked well for a while. It did exactly what we wanted it to do. It got us off the ground. We had a platform that worked and was tested. We didn't own or control that platform in any way, though. So if there was a change we needed, for example, I don't know, enhancing disability accessibility, it became very difficult for us in that situation of non-ownership to get that implemented as a priority. You know, we're dealing with a provider who's trying to cater to multiple clients, multiple competing design priorities on what they've got for their platform. It's not necessarily the ideal situation, but we used that time when we were with Ubiquity to design and build our own workflow platform for what we were doing behind the scenes. We wrote it in Python, so that basically, you know, one of the most popular programming languages in the world, so it's easy to hire people to work on it, which was an HR and social decision behind the technology choice. But that platform was built over, as I said, over the course of about a year. It started as a weekend hobby project and evolved into a full-time software development initiative. The platform's called Janeway. It's a scholarly communications workflow management tool. And we own it, control it, understand it, operate it now, and we migrated all our journals to it a few years ago, and managed to get off Ubiquity, giving us better cost savings by running our own platform. And, you know, it's just been getting better ever since. I guess the challenge is we had to build a workflow that worked for scholarly communications, which is a very specific space. It's really, there's nothing else quite like it. It's not as though you can take a generic workflow platform and just say, right, we'll use that. We had to think about, you know, where does peer review sit in this, for example? I don't know if people know what peer review is. It's when academics submit research. It has to be vetted by other academics to whether it can be published. But there's debates about whether that should be done before something's made public or afterwards, for example. So pre-review, where somebody says that shouldn't be published, so the article never sees the light of day. Or you make the work public so everyone can read it, and then afterwards you get academic opinions on it who say, there's some problems with this, look at this and this and this, and everybody can see the dialogue going on. So, you know, we had decisions about what to do with the platform and its workflow and where you put review in that status chain. But it's been a really interesting experience building it and learning about different spaces and their demands and the differences between them and how we can cater to as many as possible with that software. Sorry, Ernesto, I think I interrupted you.
No, that's great. I was going to say that as a user, a long-time user now, I agree on how well it's working really, and the improvements that have been noticeable from a user experience. Just moving on a little bit, I know I dropped that question out of order from what we had previously discussed, so I apologize for that. But going back to the idea of social justice, Martin, is it correct to say that you see open access as a matter of social justice? And could you elaborate if you see it or not, like a question of social justice?
So yes, I see it as a matter of social justice, and I'll explain why in a second. But the really interesting thing about open access is that there are several parties involved in its realization, theorization, creation, whatever you want to call that, who have different competing ideologies and ideals that they believe open access contributes to. So it's at this intersection of a set of different people. So there's a whole group of people for whom open access is merely a way in which small business enterprises, for example, can get access to engineering papers so that they can improve their systems, and it helps them. And it's, a very neoliberal economy of they'll get a benefit from this. They paid tax, so they should get access to it. And there's not much social justice in that angle of things. It might have its own unique benefits. There might be upsides to that view. Maybe it's good that our small enterprises can thrive and get access to this stuff. But that's very different to, say, scholars in South Africa who are saying, we can't get access to papers from the global north. Our institution can't afford them. We can't publish our papers open access because we can't afford the fees that these journals charge as well. For me, doing open access right unlocks a whole global discourse of academic communication. It lets everybody participate in reading and having access to research in a way that you would not see if you didn't have open access as a principle. And that's a very different stance to the people who have that small enterprise view. But it doesn't really matter in a way, because we both want the same thing. We both want open access to happen. And there are just different motivations behind it. And I think that's where projects tend to succeed, actually, is where you've got a practical thing you want to do and several different political ideologies coming together and saying, you know what, actually, although we're very different in what we believe and why we're doing this, we think that we actually want to achieve the same thing. There are open access advocates who are very strongly opposed to that view I've just articulated. They think that would be a compromise. It would be a hideous pollution of the ideal situation with open access, where it's all just about ensuring that everybody has access, regardless of whether they can pay. So the poor and the rich, the global north and the global south, the poorest person who's got access to the internet versus the richest person. But I think that the pragmatic stance is to say, well, so what that they don't want it for that reason and have this other goal behind it. We can't block their other goal. It would be very hard to reconfigure open access to make sure that didn't happen. So let's work with them to make this a reality.
What's just quickly, what's your view on article processing charges obviously in the humanities, as you already suggested, it was even more of a shock, the notion, the whole idea that authors would be asked to pay to publish their own work, even if that had been happening somehow indirectly before through institutions or libraries. Do you see APCs as a necessary step, or do they have positive aspects? What's the story with APCs from your perspective?
So I think that article processing charges are a result of lazy business thinking from academic publishers. Okay, so it's always worth thinking about publishing and these type of enterprises as a labor-driven organization. So there is always labor going on at a publisher that we need, that we can't get rid of, that somehow needs to be done somewhere. So that needs to be funded. People can't work for free. That's unethical. That's something we need to think about. So what they did was they said, right, we used to compensate that labor and make a profit or whatever we do by selling this material that we've published. So each of you pays a small amount, and essentially there's enough money to pay for the labor of publishing that academic article. Okay, it's, that sounds like a fairly typical business model. That's what you had in the sales model. Then we said, okay, actually, you know what? We don't want you to sell that anymore. We want everybody to get access to it without paying, to get free access to this material. And they scratch their heads and say, okay, but that's really problematic because all of our revenue comes from people having exclusive access to this and paying us for it. And if they don't do that, how are we going to compensate the labor? So they turned around and said, okay, well, let's re-envisage what we do as a service to the people who are coming to us to publish. And we get the paper peer reviewed, we typeset it, we copy edit it, we proofread it, we submit it to digital preservation, we put it on a platform. So we'll put all those as propositions to an author and their institution, their academic organization, and say, well, you know what, you should pay this now because we're doing it for you, so your work can be disseminated widely and everyone can read it for free. Now that that sounds good in theory, but they really haven't thought about that distribution aspect that I talked to you about earlier, that if we can spread the cost as a sales model does and as our consortial model does at OLH, you've got a much better model that doesn't have this unequalizing effect. And it's just a real problem of exclusion, and that's a social justice issue. Some institutions, particularly in poorer parts of the world, really cannot afford an article processing charge of £3,000 just for a single article. It's not going to fly. They can't do it. But the other thing we know is that at the moment, we can afford to publish all the research that's published in the world right now. I mean, Elsevier, the largest academic publisher in the world, makes 33% or more profit per year on billions of pounds of revenue. It's far more profitable by percentage profit than Shell Oil, than Big Pharma. Those are sort of running at 18%, and they're running at 30+%. There is enough money in the system to make this work. The problem is turning it around, getting it into a central location, and then publishing the work based on merit without charging people in a way that they can't afford. So really, it's a social problem of organization, collectivism, and pooling resources to achieve the compensation of labor that makes the social justice results of open access viable economically. Sorry if that's might be a little bit complicated, but hopefully I've explained that in a clear enough way.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Definitely thought-provoking. And finally, the rise of, I'm sorry, I have to mention it, Marty, but the rise of Gen AI. And yeah, obviously the profound transformation of search by AI. The potential changes to copyright law or policy, and the current reactions of or resistance perhaps of the creative industries, at least in the UK, towards the Gen AI situation. Could you tell us a bit more, like from your perspective, how do we balance the potential paradoxes between openness, fairness, and big corporations potentially, arguably profiting from intellectual labor without paying their original creators?
So this is a very tricky area, but
yeah, I know. Sorry.
one of the one of the original goals of open access was to open material to text and data mining potentials. And, one of the arguments made was that having academic material openly accessible and made computationally accessible would yield a new way of searching the literature. We might find new things by computational methods that text and data mine these papers, synthesize them into something new, and produce novel outcomes through that process. We didn't know what that would look like in 2012, 2002, when the Budapest Open Access Initiative was signed. It was just a glimmer on the horizon, but it was one of the things that was thought interesting and promising, and one of the reasons that open licenses were applied in the open access space. When it's actually happened, we've had text and data, basically Gen AI training is text and data mining on a massive scale. It's ingesting tons and tons of material to the point where you have a model where the statistical average can produce useful language from what it's synthesized across all these papers, across all this content that is brought in. People don't like it. They say you've stolen my material when it's harvested by a Gen AI harvester. Well, that was the goal of some of the open access movement. So it's hard to say you couldn't see that coming. But they have also used material that is not openly accessible, that is just available in pirate archives. And it's potentially difficult. If an author relies on sales of their material, they suddenly see someone using it and think that's outrageous. But it's really, US copyright law has a thing called transformative use, which is a fair use provision where if you do something completely unanticipated with a work and transform it into something that the author couldn't have anticipated, you are allowed to do that with copyrighted material. That material is there for people to find ways to use that the author didn't anticipate. If the author thought of it and wanted to sell it in that form, that's not acceptable, and that would have been copyright violation. But I'm pretty sure that US courts will rule in the near future that Gen AI harvesting is transformative use. It's something novel that comes out of the use of copyrighted material. And this discourse also hides a lot of misunderstanding about the history of copyright. Copyright is a time-limited right to sell work that expires, and then things become public domain. The point of copyright is not actually the individual economic protection that people think it is to ensure that once that is done and people have had their share of it, the work is publicly available for free forever for everyone. It becomes openly accessible as the default. And that was a bargain struck between various publishers and the government in the Statute of Anne back in previous centuries. But this is really all just being questioned now when we come to Gen AI, and there are some very bad copyright arguments coming through that don't understand that history, and think that basically copyright should be perpetual forever and for one person. But my personal stance is AI is not going away. We're not going to get rid of it. So it should be as good as it can be, and it should serve us as best as it possibly can. And I think that having high quality academic papers that have the truth in them available for synthesis and training is a much better way to ensure these things do give us a truthful and reliable account when we ask them, rather than them going to Reddit and ingesting some horrific content that is completely inaccurate and having that as their training base. So that's how I see it. I don't think we're going to block it and it's going to go away. It's something we have to live with, and we should live with it being as good as possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so we have reached the end of our time dedicated to the Q&A, but we have time for a couple of questions from the crowd in the room. Would someone like to ask Martin something in the context of much of the lecture or his talk? He's looking at you now.
I can see you, yeah.
He doesn't bite. It's okay if you don't have questions as well. You sure? we are very lucky to have you here.
Someone's got a hand up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I just clicked on something that I shouldn't have clicked on. Okay. Yes. Okay, we can try.
If you speak, Ernesto could repeat the question to me afterwards. Is probably the best way to do it.
What's your perspective on how the internet started off essentially as a system to openly transfer information, and now it becoming something that's no more behind web developers and private servers, and how that kind of applies to this open access?
Yeah, so did you get, I think someone managed to pick that up on the captions, but your perspective on the history of the internet as a system that started as intended to transfer, share information, and the current landscape of privatization of the online landscape.
Yeah,
in relation to open access, what you've been talking about.
That's a really great point and question, actually. The history of the internet is quite a complex phenomenon, with the original ARPANET coming out of Stanford when it was first developed, and Janet Abbate, in her book about inventing the internet, clearly makes it very clear that the original goals of the internet would serve a military command and control perspective. They were US military funded. They had to build a communication network that was resilient and particularly decentralized. I mean, we were in a post-Cold War context at the birth of the internet. And the fear was, well, what happens if we build a centralized communication system that relies on some complete unit in the US where all communication goes through that? It will immediately become a target for any potential military adversary. And if it's destroyed, our digital communication network falls apart. So they were tasked with building a network that was resilient and distributed and could route around any problems that were found in it. But the thing was, you've got this very interesting combination of people again. It's this combination of political ideologies that I talked about earlier. You've got people with a military ideology coming together with a hippie intellectual culture at Stanford of people who believe in the open, free sharing of information, that everything should be free and open, and with that social justice mission. But they both want to build a decentralized network that can't be shut down. One group wants to build it because they think the government will come to them and shut them down. The other group wants to build it because they think that the Russian government will come and shut down their network. But they both want the same thing at the core of it. They want this open dissemination. And so you see this gradual network build out from Stanford to other academic institutions. And that's where they start sharing information between themselves, the hippie academics. They're posting their computer science and physics papers on these FTP servers between the original nodes on the internet. And from then on, for some people, the logic is just clear. Information and research should be freely shared using these digital systems that allow for infinite replication. Other people who've been entrenched in print cultures for decades have a lot of trouble adjusting their mindset to this new digital world and what it offers and what it can bring. But I think you're just right in the insinuation there that the core logic of why the internet developed and was built contains within itself the logic of open access and the idea that open sharing could be a social justice project of the internet, and it's logical to pursue that given what the technology offers.
Great question. I was thinking along similar lines. I keep thinking every open access week I think of Aaron Swartz. You mentioned Stanford there, and he went to Stanford, didn't he? And Lawrence Lessig was in Stanford, and or I don't know if he was in Harvard by then, but yeah, Aaron. So apologies if this is wrong. We need to fact check, but he was a university student, and he also got to work with Tim Berners-Lee, and it was that motivation of free culture, free culture T-shirts, openness as a human right, a way to keep government under control, and things have suddenly moved towards a situation in which this very same technology has been and is being used sort of like in an opposite direction, or yeah, contradicting those ideals almost.
Have you told the group about Aaron Swartz and what happened to him and who he was and that?
I only alluded to it very briefly, but no, I
I
needed
mean, it's
to.
just worth saying that.
Yeah.
So he was the developer of the RSS protocol, the really simple syndication feeds, and worked a lot on Creative Commons. But his final project, in a set, was to download all of the material on JSTOR from the academic network he was based in, with the suspicion that his goal was to release this, whether it was in copyright or not. So basically a kind of guerrilla liberation project for information. But this all went very wrong when his downloading script was discovered. The FBI swooped in on him. He was faced with excessive federal charges, and he killed himself, sadly, still basically a teenager. It was absolutely devastating. You know, this pioneer of the open access movement and early sort of martyr for the cause in the end. But it does show how strongly copyright is enforced and how authoritarian the clampdown was against basically a teenager who was trying to do some good in the world, even though it violated copyright law. And it's an extremely sad case, but you know, it does show there's no way we can do this in ways that are illegal. We can't really work around the system as it stands. We've got to change the system for it to work properly if we don't ourselves want to face those legal threats and end up in dire situations. Sorry, there was a question on the front row, I think.
No, you answered it was about the projects that Aaron was working
Yeah, sure.
on.
He says you've answered the question already.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, so you mentioned the 33% profit margin for that's publisher.
Elsevier.
Yeah. And so obviously there's monetization there. And I also think about copyright. And if I remember rightly, copyright was meant to give the author the chance to work, adapt and improve and create more stuff based upon their work. And then kind of got extended, and then used more for a perhaps monetary reason. I'm just thinking, is that possibly just going to happen again with any implementation of what you're doing, what other people are doing? Like that's, it's a, you know, I think maybe that's been trying to prevent, or not necessarily prevent, but that someone might come up with a way that actually works against open access to monetize it, but using some of the principles or something. Is that something that's thought of?
So I did hear that, by the way. So thank you for that question. And you've got a very loud voice, obviously, or sitting closer.
I'm being deliberately loud.
So I guess organizations that run open access publishers are not in a very good position to monetize the content that comes in, because essentially they're giving it away for free, and they put an open license on it so other people can take it and redistribute it. And you know, it's a bit like Odysseus binding himself to the mast as he goes past the sirens. They've kind of tied their own hands by saying it's openly licensed. You know, they've made it very difficult to sell. Although open access book publishers, for example, sell copies of the physical print book that they produce, you know, and they do charge for that. So as long as there's a digital copy openly available, you know, they can sell print, and there's a demand for that, because is it fun reading 80,000 words of a book on screen? Not particularly. You know, actually the print codex and the print volume still holds a huge appeal to people. So you know, that's a way that they could monetize things, but that's a way that most authors are pleased to be monetized. You know, they don't care if you sell their books. They want a print copy. You know, it's nice to give to your grandma and say, look, I wrote a book. You know, to see people reading it in public, to have it in bookstores, you know, this is all good for the dissemination of the work. And I guess this is what's different about the open access space of academic publishing and other spaces of publishing or other spaces of work is that academics don't really expect a direct return on what they publish and produce. What they expect is if they can get their work published and respected by other academics and peer reviewed and sanctioned by a publisher who has a prestige factor, they will take that back and either get an academic job as a result of it, or they will be promoted, or they, recognized in some way at their institution. So basically, the monetary return for the author comes in the employment status that is conferred by the prestige of the publication. So these publications start to serve as a kind of proxy for evaluating people and whether they're any good. It's very odd. You don't get that in, say, publishing a novel. It's, publish a novel and get it with a prestigious publisher. It's not going to make any difference. You need to sell it to actually make money as an author in that context. In the academic context, it doesn't matter if only 2 people in the world read your paper, but they are really senior people and really important, and it changes a whole field of study, for example, because of what you did. That's what might get you the kudos to get your promotion and your monetary return centrally. So I'm not clear that academic authors have the same desire to see various forms of self-monetization of what they've published. They're very happy to give that to a publisher and let them monetize it in whatever way they see, because it's not of value to them until it's published by the person they want it to be published with. So there's quite a complex symbolic economy basically going on here that maps onto that real economy and makes things tricky to understand. But that's what I think is going on. What academics don't like, though, is when it seems recently, and this comes back to the Gen AI stuff we were just talking about, if you publish something with an open access publisher, they make it available for free. You've given it away in the spirit of good faith, and you've done that for public good, for readership, for worldwide global discourse, and so on. And then a for-profit corporation comes along, trains their AI model on your work without any recognition, monetary comeback, and so on. For me, that's not a problem. For other people, they think it's a very big moral problem and wrong, and they don't want to do it. But the way I see it is, I have licensed my work for anybody to use, and I'm afraid that includes for-profit corporations. Those I agree with, those I don't agree with. But that's just part of taking the risk, I guess, of open thinking and open practices. You don't know who or what is going to do something with your work, and if you surrender the rights to it, you just have to go with it and see, that's interesting. I didn't anticipate that happening.
Excellent, beautiful. All right. Yeah.
Cheers.
Someone else? People, just do you have time for one last question, Martin, from me?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Well, this module is relatively new. It's on its 3rd year, and it's the 2nd year I lead it. So a question that maybe in some of our minds might be, what does it have to do with design? And of course, we have referred to very literally to the work on Janeway, right? And so that implies interaction design and user-centered research. I will share later a link to an article published that evaluates the management systems, including Janeway, that a colleague of us published recently in 2020. But how do you think of that? I mean, isn't the usability of the whole scholarly publishing landscape a big problem? We were chatting earlier about how some people's experience of research is that it should be full of friction, that if there's no friction, there is no research work, that it should be very difficult to access something for it to be valuable almost. What are your views on this?
Yeah, so I guess first, the term design is a very broad term. You know, we design all sorts of things. We can design systems, we can design interfaces, we can design software, but we also, you know, we always design social systems. We have to think about how do social groupings, social hierarchies, governance structures affect how easy something is or otherwise to use. When you're designing a software interface, for example, you can't just sit down and do it in isolation. You have to reach out to groups of people. You have to think about if you're going to be user centric, you can't just imagine your users. You have to actually find some of them, talk to them, find out their real life, you know, aspects of what they need from a system, and design your social structures to support that. So it's very important that new organizations that are trying to be user centric and trying to design interfaces that work for their clientele, their customers, whatever the people using it might be called, have a say in how an organization is run, and have essentially the buck stop governance at the end of it that says they can tell designers what is needed because they know it themselves and are involved in the process. So, you know, our governance structure has a lot of academics on advisory boards to tell us precisely what's needed so that we can go to them for consultation when we're building things. In terms of the friction point that we were discussing earlier, Ernesto, it really bugs me that some people think that, you know, that endless friction you encounter when you come up with the paywall sign that says sign in here using your institution, and you try and sign in using your institution doesn't have access, so then you go and try and find the original piece in some green open access repository and it's not there either, so then you go and ask the author and the author emails you the paper. You know, what kind of interface is that to scholarship? But that's basically what we've got, and lots of people, as Ernesto said, think that really is the process of research. You know, it's getting hold of the thing is as much part of the process as reading it, synthesizing it, and producing new research from those models. So I find this very frustrating. I just think, but that's pathetic. What if you could just click something and get access to this paper, and you didn't have to spend 3 days waiting for the author to email you back so you can get one crucial thing for your research that's blocking you? It's not doing research. That's you know, anyone can technically do what you're doing, which is discovery, but it's become part of this discourse that's what we have to do to get access. So, you know, that's how long it takes, and that's why research is so time consuming, and it just really bugs me. So I just think, in order of priority, designing social systems is almost the most crucial part of interface design. It's something that you have to get right from the start. Who's involved? What are the stakeholders? What does your organization look like? And it's only then that you can get user stories, get ideas of what you're going to actually build in whatever faces your users, whether that's software or you know, a human interface. But that's my experience of it, and that's why design plays a key role in what we were trying to do.
So much. Very useful. Thank you for your time, Martin.
You're welcome. Very nice to meet you all.
Wonderful.
I hope you enjoy the course. Thank you.